Okay, I think we'll start now then. Good morning, everyone. My name is Keith Barrow. I am the Senior Officer here at Kazan, and I would like to welcome you to this webinar, Creating Transformative Change, Enacting Epistemic Justice in Nursing Practice Education and Scholarship and Research. This is part one of a four-part webinar series, with today focusing on teaching nursing students to use an epistemic justice lens in evidence-based practice. Before I jump into more information about today's presentation, I'd like us to take a moment to pay respect to the lands in which we are situated. The Canadian Association of Schools of Nursing respectfully acknowledges that its national office is located on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin people. Kazan would like to acknowledge and pay respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home, and we acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. Today's webinar will begin with a presentation, and we'll conclude with time for questions at the end. To submit a question, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. We encourage you to use the chat functions to discuss and share with your fellow participants, and we will also be posting links in chat as well throughout the webinar. And notice also, as well as that today's presentation will be recorded and posted on Kazan's YouTube channel for future viewing. A recording as well as the slides will be sent out to all who have registered as well. And with that, I am pleased and honored to have with us today Ashley McEwen, Heather Campbell, and Catherine Holmes. We'd like to thank you very much to all our speakers for coming together for today's presentation. And with that, I'll turn things over to them.
Thank you, Keith. So as Keith has shared, today we're here to talk to you about teaching nursing students to use an epistemic justice lens in their evidence-based practice. And this is our first part of a four-part webinar series where we are really seeking to explore how we can enact epistemic justice in nursing practice, education, scholarship, and research. The webinar series will be facilitated by various presenters. So myself today and Heather Campbell and Catherine Holmes or Katie Holmes will be facilitating today's session. And other presenters will be sharing with us along our journey as well. But we also really wanted to start off this webinar series in a good way. And thank you for acknowledging the land, Keith, in that much of our work is informed by decolonial practices and approaches. So as we gather here today, we also wanted to acknowledge the land we are presently. So Western University is located Betikaweganon, which in Anishinaabe Ojibwe means at the side flow, and the name reflects the location now known as London, Ontario, alongside the Deshkenzabing or Antler River, which is referred to by settlers as the Thames River. And this waterway flows through the heart of southwestern Ontario and connects Western universities with many First Nation communities. Western University and the Arthur Labatt Family School of Nursing are located on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lil'watpowak, and Kanatin nations, with connections also to the Huron-Wendat Nation. And the area is covered by London Township Treaty 6, Sombra Township Treaty 7, and Longwoods Treaty 21. Betikaweganon, or at the side flow, has been in relation with diverse Indigenous nations since time immemorial. Yet the Crown, despite the Crown's sacred commitments through treaty agreements, colonial agents have continuously sought to diminish their meaning. The treaties were not mere real estate deals. They have been misrepresented. They are living agreements that are of shared peace and stewardship, and are there to guide sustainable coexistence between people and land itself. And it's essential to recognize that much of what we now call as Canada, it actually remains as unceded territories, meaning that many Indigenous nations never surrendered or legally signed away their land to the Crown. This colonial legacy is deeply tied to our institutional history here at Western University. So Huron College which was founded in 1863 as a theological college and one of Western University's founding institutions, was established with the explicit mission to evangelicalize the indigenous peoples of the lower Great Lakes. And its leaders were connected with several nearby residential schools, including Mohawk Institute Residential School in Bradford. Their efforts sought to assimilate Indigenous children through Christian and Eurocentric education and a history that continues to shape the foundations of Western University and the broader Canadian Academy. As nurse educators, we cannot separate ourselves from this history and current ongoing challenges that we observe in nursing education. The nursing profession has long been complicit in colonial structures, from early partnerships with church-run hospitals to the ways our curricula have privileged and continue to privilege Western biomedical knowledge systems and marginalize Indigenous and other land-based ways of knowing. The TRC, or the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, calls upon us, health organizations and nurses in academic institutions, to recognize and implement the healthcare rights of Indigenous peoples. And of those 94 calls to action, 7 of them very specifically pertain to health, and in fact, 3 name nursing specifically. As nurses, we are responsible for educating the next generation. We must be accountable for advancing these calls of action, and each of us must be personally and professionally responsible to act on them. These are not abstract goals. They are embedded in our entry to practice competencies across our provinces and territories within ethical standards for our profession. And this work is reflected nationally as well. So, as Keith has just shared, CAUSN does acknowledge that as a national organization, it operates across the land we currently call Canada. And this is land from which First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people have developed deep and diverse knowledges and medicinal systems. Systemic racism, colonial violence are all embedded in Western academia and have led to nursing education largely discounting land-based learnings and teachings, Indigenous knowledge systems, oral knowledges, and lived experiences as valid ways of knowing. And as CAUSN states, they do strive to enable all knowledges and experiences to inform the advancement of nursing education. And this is exactly why we're here today. So the essence of epistemic justice work that we've been doing in nursing is to recognize that knowledge systems are not neutral, and whose knowledges we privilege in our teaching practices determines who is seen as credible, competent, and worthy of care. And this is how we are guiding our learners. So as we begin today's session, I just want to invite everyone to reflect on their roles within these intertwined current and historical contexts of land and nursing and knowledge. And our task not only to acknowledge these truths, but to act on them, to teach, to practice, and lead in ways to restore balance, honor relationships, and advance justice and health equity and healing. Heather, can you go to the next slide? So yeah, we just wanted to quickly introduce ourselves too. So you'll be seeing a lot of me in every session. My name is Ashley McEwen. I'm a lecturer at the Arthur Labatt Family School of Nursing, and I'm a cisgendered, straight, allied white settler with Irish and Scottish ancestry. I come to this work with significant privilege. My appearance allows me to navigate space in positions of power, and this is an unearned privilege I hold. At the same time, I do hold invisible identities that experience oppressive challenges in navigating space in Canadian context. I'm a single mother, I'm a survivor of domestic violence, I'm neurodivergent, and these identities shape my approach to teaching. My work as a nurse and an educator is really grounded in the perspective that academia has long privileged Euro-Western colonial ways of knowing and doing, and I'm committed to ongoing unlearning and working towards how I might hold multiple truths and be guided by two-eyed seeing approaches. And this is my lifelong work. I'll let Heather and Katie introduce themselves now.
Thanks, Ashley. My name's Heather Campbell. I'm a white settler of Scottish and Irish descent. My dad's family came from Scotland as part of Treaty 65 negotiations in the Parry Sound region. My mom's family came from Ireland as part of Treaty 45 and a half, which is Grey County settlement. They both relocated to London, Ontario, where they met, they raised my sister and I, and where I met my spouse. We are raising my child here, who's the best. I joined this work as a like, well, you're going to hear why. There are librarians speaking to you about nursing education. But one of the things that I've dedicated my work to doing at Western Libraries is how might we maybe not decolonize the institution, but initiate decolonial learning as a community. And so I'll be able to share more about that. But like Ashley, I come to this work with a lot of visible privileges. I recognize that I come to this work also through the lens of neurodivergence, but that means that I still have a lot of privilege to unpack and unlearning. I'll turn it over to Katie.
Great, thanks, Heather. So I'm Katie. I'm a cisgender woman and a fourth generation white settler of English and Scottish descent. At Western, I'm a teaching and learning librarian, and I specialize in the undergraduate health sciences. And knowledge justice work has really resonated with me because as a librarian, I often felt uncomfortable with the way that I was telling people about how to seek knowledge, and I felt like there was a better way. And so I have done a lot of learning and unlearning in this process, and being able to explore the knowledge justice lens has been really meaningful, and has allowed me to connect with both students and faculty. And so I'm excited to be here today.
I think the slides stopped sharing, Heather. So, thank you. Yeah, so tell your friends because we're here for 4 webinar sessions. Today is just part 1. We hope to take you all on a journey together and recognize that we're teaching about enacting epistemic justice in various layers of academia. Today is very much how we're teaching this to undergraduate students. So if you yourself are even unfamiliar with epistemic justice as a premise, we're going to unpack that today and how we teach it with students and support everyone in learning from our lens. And in later sessions, we're going to talk about how we might enact it in our educational practice, how might we enact it in our scholarship and our research practice, and even speak to it from a leadership lens in academic contexts in terms of what we might be trying to engage with in terms of institutional transformation and approaches to ICAP, for example. You can come to one or all of the sessions. They're recorded. Please tell your colleagues about this work. And so what are we going to talk about today? Today, we are going to talk about how we got here. We're going to talk about what epistemic justice is, and then we're going to go through how we do teach this to students in terms of speaking about power, privilege, positionality. We are going to have all of us engage in what epistemic injustices might look like in nursing education specifically, as well as then thinking about how we might act on this in terms of enacting epistemic justice in our information seeking behaviors and how we might evaluate the knowledge that we find, and some final reflections on teaching this. I've shared a little QR code here, which will take you to a resource folder for these slides. And this will be the same folder we can continue to populate for the next couple months, where we will share all sorts of things, including assessments we've developed, etc., so that you can have these resources and do this yourself in your own institutions if they are meaningful and supportive to you. Because a lot of the justice work that we do doesn't need to be replicated. It would be great if we could work as communities together in doing this work.
Content from today is coming from an open educational resource that Ashley, Katie, and I were a part of creating over the past 8 months, a labor of love and a gift to you. So we'll be taking content from across the chapters here as a way to sort of demonstrate both how we're approaching knowledge justice teaching with nursing students at Western University, but also so that you have a resource to share with your own students and to build upon for your own professional development. So it was created under a Creative Commons license. You're welcome to use and adapt it to link it within your course resources. It has a mix, as you'll see, of videos, text. There's a workbook for you to provide with your students. And we hope over the next year, with your assistance and feedback, to create a teaching guide that will explain how you might implement it in your own teaching. In the folder of resources that we've just shared, you'll see the link to the book as well. And we'll be sharing using, honestly, some of its content throughout our webinar this morning so you can see what it's like. A little bit of background to that work, both our collaboration between the library and the School of Nursing, as well as the creation of that book, is a little story time, is when I joined Western University in 2020, I filled the role of curriculum librarian. And so I crossed between the Center for Teaching and Learning in a curriculum capacity and in leading strategic curriculum and pedagogy development for Western libraries. And when I first joined, there was a commitment of the teaching and learning team to investigate how we might initiate curriculum decolonization. As we will discuss throughout the next 4 series, we will recognize that that work is ongoing. It's generations long work and will take some time. But the result of our initial work in the years of 2021 and 22 were the identification of 6 new learning outcomes centered around knowledge justice. The slides, yep, I see your question in the chat, Kristen. The slides, the curriculum, so these learning outcomes, as well as an article that my colleague Dan Sitch and I wrote about our decolonization process, are all found in the link of folders, nope, the other way, the folder of links that we've just shared. And so that gives some background context of where we've landed and why really that we've grounded our work in knowledge justice. And to sum it up, really, it's that a recognition from the academic librarians teaching at Western University is that we have been stewards of only one way of knowing. We have been privileging Euro-Western and Eurocentric knowledges. And while those knowledges and our approach to research have value, in so doing, we've been contributing and very much complicit in the silencing and marginalization of diverse knowledges. So what that's meant is both commitment to knowledge justice as a library community, as well as, to be honest, a little bit of an experimentation over the last couple of years of exploring, like, what does this mean for our teaching? Most of academic libraries we teach or are expected to teach the Association of College and Research Libraries framework for information literacy, which comes as a branch of the American Library Association. And in trying to explore what knowledge justice centered teaching would look like, it's meant that we've needed to come up with our own working definition of what that work has meant. And so the working definition we share in the open educational resource, and the one that we'll be using throughout the next 4 webinar series, is a recognition that that every person, has the equal capacity to be knowledgeable, but that this right is often denied to individuals based on the social identities that they hold. It also involves recognizing that some knowledge systems, particularly those of Indigenous peoples and particularly First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples here, have been purposefully ignored, silenced, or eliminated. And so in getting to know this term, I want to really acknowledge that there is epistemic injustice within the study of epistemic injustice. That this term often, and I'll just, this is a new area of scholarship for some of you, I'll highlight that the term epistemic injustice to describe this phenomena, that there are ways of knowing and knowledges that are eliminated or silenced. A lot of your literature does rely on this term of epistemic injustice, and particularly the scholarship of Miranda Fricker, who is a social philosopher, and Dotson, as you can see under the health sciences here. But I want to recognize that this is not new work. This is not a new concept, and by any stretch, epistemic injustice is not the only term. These phrases there are many different ways of describing this phenomena from a variety of perspectives, Indigenous perspectives, decolonial included. So one I want to highlight here is the work of Marie Baptiste, a Mi'kmaq scholar who describes cognitive imperialism. And so we have a reference to her work in our open educational resource. And so there's a reason why Western libraries and our collaboration with the Arthur Labatt School of Nursing specifically is using the term knowledge justice. And it's both to recognize that this concept has a lot of different names, and also that To be honest, epistemology is a tough swallow. It's a phrase that not all folks are familiar with, and we want to make sure that when we're talking about these concepts, it's inviting to all folks. And so we thought injustice related to knowledge, justices related to knowledge was a more accessible term. And so, honestly, a collaboration with Ashley over the last few years has allowed us to really have some freedom to explore what does this mean for teaching? How might we go about doing this work? And it's together in partnership with her that we've recognized that to practice knowledge justice, first we have to challenge the dominance of Euro-Western systems. And we'll be showing you how we do that in partnership with students today. We have to act on our responsibility to engage in meaningful dialogue across multiple and diverse perspectives. So honoring the tradition of a biomedical model within nursing, and then looking about how we can make room within it. For diverse ways of knowing. And how we do that is by approaching nursing, approaching our own ways of knowing, including librarianship, through with humility and acknowledging that there are edges or limits to what we can understand through our own epistemology. And in doing so, and in committing to this unlearning work, we can learn to see the world through multiple ways of knowing and approach diverse epistemologies with an open mind.
So, in continuing with story time, as Heather has shared, my engagement in this work actually started in and around, I think we discovered 4 years ago, when I came to a Center for Teaching and Learning presentation where Heather was sharing about the new library curriculum that they had articulated that did include those epistemic justice learning outcomes. At the time, I was redeveloping a foundations course in nursing. And I basically sat in that lecture and had come to the conclusion that I have been thinking about things wrong my whole life and was trained to think that way. And this led to the work that I am doing currently in our undergraduate curriculum, that in my role as the Faculty of Health Sciences Fellow that's supported by a grant from the Center of Teaching and Learning, where I really reflected that in nursing, we talk about our entry to practice competencies very specifically, that we must be engaging in evidence-based decision making. But often when we talk about what that best evidence is in evidence-based decision making, we are assuming that Euro-Western epistemologies are what is best evidence. And this really does marginalize, silence, and exclude other diverse knowledge systems like Indigenous knowledge systems. Often in nursing, we enact cognitive imperialism, as Baptista say, like Heather shared when talking about how epistemic justice is articulated by many scholars. Now, how does this all connect to nursing as well? I'm looking at this in a way where if we teach students to engage with diverse knowledge systems in a way that we can support them to see value and truth in many systems, I see a connection here between the practice of cultural humility and the potential for how we might actually create more culturally safe healthcare spaces when supporting students to enact epistemic justice when seeking out the best evidence to make decisions for client care. So that's what it looks like in undergraduate. But what has happened? So if you go to the next slide, in our program, this has over the last 4 years led to us teaching this in many other courses. So we teach this in our Foundations of Nursing course, but in our undergraduate program, we also teach this content in our Research Methods course. And graduate level in our Masters of Nursing course-based leadership program, as well as our nurse practitioner program, this content is integrated into our critical appraisal related learning. And also in our master's thesis-based program, we're teaching it in both qualitative and quantitative research methods. And even at a PhD level, we're talking about this at a qualitative research, in our qualitative research courses. And the biggest thing that I will say in terms of how our teaching might change, although today we're focusing more so on an undergraduate context, is when we start to talk about people in thesis-based programs about epistemic justice, we begin to reframe the discussion not so much as where we're seeking voices, but taking on the responsibility of those who are now creators of knowledge for your discipline, and how you have autonomy to enact epistemic justice in the knowledge that you are producing within your discipline, to potentially create space for more for knowledge systems that haven't been included in creating knowledge, and as a way to potentially create more inclusive knowledge as nurses ourselves. So, if we talk about, before we even get into talking about teaching epistemic justice, I want to share with you two critical learnings we've had in terms of our pedagogical practice and how to teach this on our journey. So, one of them is that before you teach about epistemic justice, you must certainly have some level of interrogation about the history of nursing and current injustices, and have very critical dialogues with your students about challenges related to systemic racism, structural violence, etc., that is been perpetrated by the profession of nursing. Also, in that, we also need to support students on critically reflecting on their own positionality before we begin to engage in epistemic justice work, so that they can recognize the power, the privilege, the biases they might hold, and oppressions they might have to navigate when providing care and when seeking care. We learned this the hard way, because when we try to teach about epistemic justice without this critical prerequisite knowledge, it's very difficult for students to understand. So now we understand that when we are teaching this content in classes, we must make sure that students have learned this content elsewhere before engaging in the epistemic justice content we teach them in our classes. So let's talk about knowledge justice in the helping profession. So this is the open educational resource, the labor of love, as Heather called it, that we've created and shared, that all of you can have access to. The audience of this resource is for students. So we really hope that you do take the content of this resource, the 6 chapters, and put it in your program where you think it could support you in teaching students. There are 6 chapters in this book, and we're going to go through them now today. And the first chapter is on power, positionality, and privilege, but we will walk you through also recognizing epistemic injustices in nursing profession, as well as what knowledge justice is, searching for diverse voices, and evaluating those voices that we found. The final chapter actually is a beautiful chapter which interviews a variety of caring professional people, including nurses, about how they enact epistemic justice in their day-to-day practice to support students in actually applying their learning directly to patient care. So let's look at the first chapter. Again, I will reorient you that one of the big resources that we leaned on in developing this chapter is also in this folder for you, where it is a positionality critical reflection module that was developed by Candice Burnett de Bossier. And so I would encourage you to go to that source as well to look at the critical reflection questions. So we actually walk our students, if we go to the next slide, Heather, through a 3-hour lecture on critically reflecting on their positionality in relation to their professional practice before we begin to talk about epistemic justice. And the purpose of this is for students to reflect on the power that they hold and the oppressions that they have to navigate as they move through their profession of nursing and caring for patients. One of the on this positionality wheel, we asked them to color in, and you can see the scribbles I made here because I tried to make it look like a pencil actually, the level of power that they hold in each social identity. So whether that be accessibility, education, housing, etc., race, and have students really reflect on, if you're coloring your petal in very fulsomely, it means you have this full level of power in that particular social identity. But if you're not coloring it in very much, you're experiencing oppressions in that particular identity. We love this positionality flower for a variety of reasons. And one of them is it does have blank spaces, and many positionality reflections don't have that, where then learners and students are actually able to think about social identities that are not listed on the wheel and name them. So sometimes students bring forward fertility as an example of an identity that they have at the forefront of their mind, and they are experiencing oppression in those contexts, and it is a really important identity to them that they would like to reflect on. So this particular wheel also gives them the opportunity to name the identities beyond what is that they're being told to reflect on. And then we also share videos from our book of a variety of people reflecting on their positionality and have facilitated discussion around that. So we'll share one with you now.
Advocating for it.
I'm Thomas. I'm a registered psychotherapist, and I work at a community mental health agency with kids and families. So as a trans male, right, I think almost sometimes I have to, I feel like there was a me prior to transitioning who experienced the world and, read information and learned in an honestly completely different way than a Thomas after transition experienced and received information, and even the way that people delivered information to me is different now, right? So just in terms of identity, right, I'm a white, I am sort of a passing, if that's what you want to call it, male. People look at me, I think sometimes, and assume that I'm cisgender. How that has impacted me in terms of identity and how I receive information, how I build relationships, I think it's made me a better listener. It's interesting, I was trying to think back of how did I maybe build relationships prior to changing a massive part of my identity to now. And it's just a lot, it's so difficult to put into words. It's just sort of a feeling, right? I wish that I could sort of articulate it. But I think I just, prior to transitioning and identifying as transgender, I just took a lot of things, I think, a lot more for granted. I just took information as how it was. I was definitely less curious. And now I think through transitioning and spending a lot of my life uncomfortable or feeling unheard and not visible, it's just made me more curious. I just can't emphasize enough a better listener. I think I trust people's words more than some other people who, when they share their experience, I think I value subjective experience and lived experience a little bit more.
Hello, my name is Ashley Campbell.
So, that was just one of many interviewees that we introduce students to when working through this content. And we do introduce students and have others role model them positioning themselves when they also hold multiple, diverse, complex positionalities. So students can also engage in critical reflection. Two of the points that I always love to pull forward from many of the beautiful things that Thomas always has to say in these interviews is identity can be fluid across our lifetime and changing. And Thomas certainly discussed that in his experience, as well as did a fantastic job connecting positionality and knowledge. One of the other core elements that we are engaging with students when teaching them about positionality is we have them reflect on who their echo chamber is by basically naming themselves and then naming a bunch of their very close confidants in the world and how those align with various social identities. So we ask the students then, looking at your best friends or your closest confidants and having also exploring their identities. Do they align with yours? where do they not align, and whose perspectives are missing. And this is to also set up the infrastructure to support students in recognizing that often in social media and in search engines, for example, we also have our echo chamber reflected to us when we are seeking information. Another important element of our positionality reflection is just highlighting that there is a stratification of power. Sometimes there can be almost a binary hierarchy when we're talking about knowledge, or when we're talking about social identity categories and how power is within them. So if it's white versus racialized individuals, but instead we spend quite a lot of time talking about the stratification of power and how it is nuanced. And usually we role model this in the context of education because everybody in the room in an undergraduate classroom has some level of power in this context, in that they are currently getting an undergraduate degree. And we explore the stratification of power and how it's nuanced between different levels of degree, educational attainment, who gives you your degree as your degree granting institution, et cetera, et cetera. And we unpack how this is all socially constructed in terms of educational attainment. And then finally, what is the most critical part of this positionality reflecting element, and why we really like to use this specific flower in our positionality work, is that on this petal there is a preferred way of knowing petal, and it names that scientific and objective ways of thinking and doing are the norm in Canadian contexts. It also names that other ways of knowing and being and doing, like Indigenous and other diverse knowledge systems, are oppressed in Canadian contexts. And this is to support learners in critically reflecting on their preferred way of knowing and doing. When I first started teaching this content, I was teaching it to fast track nursing students, and often these students were coming to us from bench science programs where they had very much a positivist or positivist lens ingrained as their preferred way of knowing without necessarily realizing it. So the intention of this is to really highlight the learner's preferred way of doing and being, and potentially that it might in fact be scientific objectivity that they prefer, and recognizing that if that is the case, they may be blinded to other diverse knowledge systems and diverse epistemologies because their worldview was made for the way the world is in terms of what knowledge systems are privileged in Canadian contexts. So it helps students to acknowledge that they may be blinded to or missing other silenced or dismissed epistemologies, and supports them in challenging how they can include more diverse epistemological worldviews when seeking information. So it's important now to also say, when we speak to this at a graduate level, we really do start to talk about epistemology of research paradigms. So this is not necessarily something we talk about in undergraduate contexts, but within academic contexts themselves, there is a hierarchy of research paradigms where scientific disciplines like nursing are typically grounded in positivism and post-positivism. And these traditional Western research paradigms often view reality as, of course, objective and separate, where Indigenous ontology views reality as interconnected with living and non-living, including the land, animals, and other beings. And reality is understood as relational and connected and found within the context of the web of all things. So, in our work, when we are teaching graduate students specifically, we are really asking learners to challenge the dominance of Euro-Western epistemologies by bringing together who they are in their personal values and reflecting on their positionality, and asking them not to sever those anymore, and in fact think about how that informs their professional nursing practice. So this is really complicated. It takes a lot of time. And through critical reflection on positionality, we really do hope that we're supporting students in recognizing that there is a dominance of Euro-Western ways of knowing and thinking and being that is rooted in the discipline of nursing.
Great. So our exploration, as Ashley said, of positionality and power really kind of sets the stage for the next chapter, which is chapter 2, where we move into a discussion about recognizing epistemic injustice. So to just give a quick definition of epistemic injustice, it's defined by Dunn in 2020 as when people undermine, undercut, disvalue, curtail, exclude, outright dismiss, or in some cases, gaslight a person or persons in their capacity as potential knowers. So here, if we're in the classroom, for example, we're really asking learners to consider the places that certain folks are denied the right to know, oftentimes because of their positionalities or the identities that they hold. And oftentimes we use this video as an example in the classroom of how epistemic injustice plays out in places that students might be familiar with, like their social media algorithms or online spaces. So we'll play that for you.
This is how it always will be.
Can you believe this person is claiming AI is racist? It is. Ableist too. Prove it. Okay, let's ask it to generate an autistic person. So, and let's do it again. And once more. In the 148 images I generated, Midjourney depicted an autistic person as being female presenting twice, as older than 30 5 times, as white 100% of the time, and 0 were smiling.
The video we just watched about algorithmic bias in AI is over 2 years old, so I wondered how much has changed given how quickly AI technology is advancing.
I used the same prompt as the TikTok creator with 7 free image generators in June 2025. The best result by far was from Copilot, which refused my prompt because autism doesn't look a certain way. You can pause to read its full response or find the transcript below. As we can see, some products now acknowledge that autistic folks both smile and may in fact be women. Bing even thinks autistic folks might want to be surrounded by a crowd of people while they paint upside-down rainbows. Jokes aside, whether or not an algorithm has been updated, if the training data used on an AI product is biased, then it will continue to generate biased results. In the over 50 images that I generated using these 7 products, the majority were still boys and men, and 100% of them were white.
Okay, so again, that's how we often introduce the conversation to students by connecting it to something that they're familiar with, which is their social media algorithms and their online environments. And we should say that we use TikTok for these examples. And you'll see that we're using TikTok for examples again in a moment, because it's a platform that most students recognize, but also because it can kind of shake up traditional notions of what students expect to see in the classroom in terms of who can hold knowledge. And so this reinforces our broader conversation about whose voices are heard in academia and whose maybe often are not. So from there, we tend to shift the conversation into how epistemic injustice shows up within education itself. And we give examples from nursing here. So the first video is on how epistemic injustice plays out within nursing textbooks. And then the other one here is an example of epistemic injustice within the DSM.
Here's an example of how racist beliefs can even get passed down in medical textbooks. This is a picture from a 2015 nursing textbook. In the chapter about pain, it teaches nurses about common cultural differences that different ethnicities have. Jews apparently are more vocal and demanding of assistance. Black patients often report a higher pain intensity and believe that suffering and pain is inevitable. Hispanics apparently believe that pain is a form of punishment and that it must be endured in order to go to heaven. The list goes on, and these assumptions are not evidence-based and reinforce harmful stereotypes. And I'll give you one guess at what race wasn't on this list, reaffirming once again that in medicine, whiteness is the norm.
The DSM is problematic for multiple reasons, but I'm going to focus on the cultural concerns and implications. DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders. We are on the 5th version of it. Each of those versions have a text revised version, which means that they did some updates based off of what was happening in the world. The first DSM was published in 1952. What was happening around that time? As it pertains to people of color, fighting to see if segregation would be illegal. Jim Crow laws were still very much in effect. And if you're thinking about people of color and their access to mental health care in 1952, it wasn't any. In 1952, during the first publication of this book, Black people and people of color were not involved in any of these studies or publications or in any of the research that was done to create this manual. Since then, this book has gone through multiple renditions, multiple edits, and the board, from my understanding, is still largely white. The DSM-5 was published in 2013. The DSM-5 Text Revised was published in 2022. They published that after clinicians, social workers, and psychologists kind of petitioned the board to update the language as it pertained to diagnostic criteria as well as language that was used within the manual. So before they had this text revised version, there was a period of 9 years that in order for clinicians to diagnose a thing, the language was very targeted and it wasn't specific to people of color, and it didn't take into account other socioeconomic concerns or even environmental concerns. That came in 2022. Even with the revisions that came in 2022, it's merely a suggestion for clinicians to keep in mind socioeconomic concerns and environment when diagnosing a client. It's not a guaranteed, right? And it also does not remind clinicians to check their bias before providing a diagnosis and looking at the whole person. So since this book is considered the mental health Bible, there are a lot of people who have their hands in the pot to create this, to make this book such a success. So the DSM has a task force of clinicians that create diagnostic criteria. As you can see, psychiatrists take up most of the space as it pertains to diagnostic criteria. Psychologists next, and other health professionals come in last. With that being said,
I might stop here and just share a little bit of context about how we use videos like this in the classroom, because I'm going to get you to do a similar activity to what we do with your students when we step in. And that is often once we've seen this, once we've talked about social media algorithms, in a different video, we talk about Google algorithms, and then we start to look at education. Students often have lived experiences that they've never been welcome to share in the classroom. And in many cases, those of us who hold positions of power at the front of the classroom also hold a lot of social privileges. And we're starting to see as the demographics of our students are shifting, their lived experiences really different from what many of us who have succeeded in academia have experienced. And so what we're finding is, again, through trial and error, like Ashley was talking about with, learning about how best to teach this, giving space at this point to welcome students' lived experience in the classroom has been critical. And so one way we could do that is through a Menti, and we're going to make you do that now. And so if this is not an activity you've used before, a Menti is sort of like an online clicker. Katie's shared and Keith has shared. Thank you, Keith. The link to Menti. And so once you click into it, it will prompt you for an 8-digit code. You can use your phone if you prefer. And I'm seeing some thumbs, which is telling me that folks are finding that. And so luckily the instructions are on the next screen. And so what we'll ask students to do is to share, have they encountered, have they witnessed, have they heard about epistemic injustices within nursing? We try to encourage them not to share sensitive and private information. But this is something that I'm actually going to encourage you to do right now so that you can think about, how difficult this can be, but also perhaps so that we can learn from one another. And so again, if you join menti.com and use the code 92080611, you can share some of the examples that you might have witnessed, and feel free to be specific. And so while we see these pop up on the screen, one that I learned about from teaching with nursing faculty is about the differences in first-line treatment for high blood pressure. And in seeing that there are race-based differences that once you follow the thread aren't grounded in good research and are resulting in really different health outcomes for Black individuals. So thank you for your participation in this activity. I'm seeing on the screen that in leadership meetings, when there's a minimization for rigor or calling out rigor from diverse ways of knowing as a way of really minimizing and committing epistemic injustice for sure. Yeah, health assessment. Photos are almost always white people in health-based textbooks. This is starting to shift. We're seeing librarians participate in this work as well and creating more open educational resources for health textbooks with diverse colors. Oops, oh no, come back. Am I able to scroll without advancing the slides? Textbooks for sure. Fat phobic comments. So make sure to check out the book. There's a whole section on fat phobia and some included videos that you can use as a discussion prompt with your students. Yep. And pain. Yes, absolutely. Pain with Black women is a case study that Ashley uses as well. Ashley, do you have any other sort of reflections? Thank you so much as folks share here.
I think that I love how they're starting to get more and more specific, actually, because they started off broad and now people are bringing up really specific questions about medical directives and sickle cell and kidney dysfunction. One of the examples we commonly use in medicine that Katie will speak to is spirometry testing. So what we will speak about this later, but I'll just mention this now is the importance of every time we teach this, and we have taught this outside of nursing, is that the epistemic injustices that we do speak to have to be discipline specific and have very good examples of how this is actually happening directly in relation to patient care. And this can also be structural, of course, so in terms of the systems, the policies, etc., but as well as what we are seeing in individual interactions.
Ashley, can I interrupt for something? Um,
Mhm.
just thinking this would be a way to highlight why partnership between faculty, disciplinary specific faculty, and librarianship has been really positive for all of us. And it's because this is something librarians can assist with, is following the thread of literature, finding examples of epistemic injustice from research. That's something that we can support with, where you can provide the clinical knowledge that we cannot. Thank you to everyone who participated. Okay, so chapter 3 then, because after discussing with faculty, or excuse me, with students about recognizing epistemic injustice can feel really heavily. Yeah, and oh yes, thank you. I see some comments in the chat about some additional examples. I can turn back to this Menti when everyone's had a chance to participate as well. But what I will say is there can be a moment in the classroom of, whoa. It can be really sensitive and emotional in bringing up these examples, particularly when we're talking about the experiences of folks sitting in the room, many of whose family members or loved ones or they themselves have experienced these kinds of epistemic injustices, whether in a health context or beyond, but in particular in education. And so chapter 3 of our book then looks at, okay, what do we do about it? And what control and power do we have as both prospective nurses and helping professionals, but also as members of an academic community? And something we talk about is the definition of knowledge justice that we shared off the top of this presentation, but also a model that we use throughout chapters 3, 4, and 5 of the remainder of the text that you can see on the screen called the Voices Flower. And in it, what we try to do is acknowledge that the biomedical research and much of the Western ways of knowing that are privileged in our academic and educational systems, they serve a function. They are important, and we talk about the value of peer review and the value of empirical research and those kinds of things. But what knowledge justice asks us to do is to acknowledge is that the only definition of knowledge, and how perhaps our diverse ways of knowing othered or silenced when we say that is the only or the best way of understanding the world. And an example it's very easy for helping professionals like nurses to recognize and to latch onto is this idea of lived experience, and that patients themselves, our clients themselves, have lived knowledge of what it's like to have health conditions, what it's like to live through different things, and how do we elevate that? And so the Voices Flower, as you can see on the screen, asks learners to provide a balance between how are they approaching evidence-based practice in a nursing context, and to hold lived experience in context with what we're calling research as arm's length observer. And we'll go through all the petals of this flower. But in considering really looking at who do we name as credible and as knowledgeable when we're talking about evidence at the front of the classroom. The other thing I'll point out before we move on is the flower is purposefully got overlapping petals like a Venn diagram to recognize that some folks can represent more than one category. Someone can have lived experience of a health condition while being in a position of power, but also as a former nurse and as a researcher, which would allow them to fall into a number of these. So we have a little case to show you what we mean by this.
And so we wanted to share the case very much from a nursing education lens. So the case study where we're hoping is going to support you in kind of understanding the voices flower a little bit better and how you might use it in your practice is about Ashley, so me, I'm not so creative, who's a nursing instructor teaching an online asynchronous pathophysiology course in nursing. And she wants to ensure her course is accessible in terms of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disability Act. And I do recognize that this is a national workshop, so you could also use your province or territory's respective accessibility laws and in relation to the search. So this is a new area of course design for Ashley. So she's looking for resources and support about what changes she might need to make when delivering the content of this course to students in alignment with this AOTA Act. So we would like to give you some time to actually engage with this activity as nurse educators, thinking about if you are really trying to meaningfully use an accessibility lens and creating an online asynchronous course about pathophysiology. So we'll give you a few minutes now to go and search for types of knowledges that you would consult when you're trying to develop this content in your course. And you only just need to maybe find, of course, 2 sources of knowledge. And if you feel comfortable sharing those in the chat before we move forward, but we'll give you a few minutes to just search what you would search to go look for this type of knowledge.
While you get yourselves ready, something I'll share is another living thing that we learn from teaching this is to have a concrete case like this when introducing students to knowledge justice is really critical, because otherwise it can feel quite vague. We have a teaching case within the OER that was written by a graduate student nurse based on her lived experience. Obviously, we're not sharing that one today. We're sharing a nursing pedagogy one instead. And we want to give you the experience of what it's like to be your student and using one of these cases. And so, yes, as Ashley said, please share 1 or 2 sources in the chat, but we will be quiet. I'll stop talking so that you have space to think for a few minutes. Thank you for getting us started there. Seeing a few. We'll give you another minute, and then as you continue to share, I'll walk us through how we use the voices flower to answer this question. So just take one more minute. Okay. As you continue to think about how would you, if you were Ashley, I'm going to put you on the spot, would ensure that your online asynchronous course is AODA compliant or accessibility compliant. We want to think about like where would I, as both a librarian but as an educational developer, where would I refer Ashley to? So the voices flower, instead of saying, okay, what's the best resource? What's the thing that I've been told to do? Asks us to stop and pause first and think about who is knowledgeable about accessibility in the classroom. And so who's affected and has lived experience? Who has to advocate for folks experiencing disability and needing accommodation? Who else is talking about this issue? It could be educators, it could be folks who, like accessibility officers, whose voices or expertise must be included when we're making informed choices. Like, for example, what rules, laws, policies for your context have to be followed. And so if we were to explore all of those lenses, we can start to break it down. So when we say power holders as a petal on the voices flower, what we mean is who holds power both over Ashley as an educator and over those who are experiencing the need for accommodation and accessibility in the classroom. And so, yes, of course, I would refer Ashley to the AODA laws themselves, as well as accessibility guidelines applicable to higher education classrooms, but also to my institution. When we say arm's length observers, this is another category of folks that might come to mind right away. And so that's where we look to journalists, researchers, research institutions, academics, like ourselves in many cases, who are trying to understand a phenomena by arm's length. I don't know if this is the right way to describe this, but what we're talking about here is there are folks who are trying to understand issues like accessibility from a broad scope. So a resource that when we talk about this in a Western University context is we really want to highlight the work of our colleague Kim Clark, who interviewed many students at Western about what their experiences were like in accessibility, and try to understand in a broad scope what's been going on. From a care provider's lens, that petal looks at who is providing care to and for individuals experiencing disability and the need for accessibility. This is nurses, this is you, this is frontline care providers. In this case of our example case here, it's also Ashley and all of you as nurse educators. It's also folks like Katie and I who are librarians, educational developers, teaching assistants, those of us who care about students who are disabled or needing accommodation. And like we've seen a lot. And so we have things that would be that we would want to share, but not necessarily from the perspective of lived experience. Similarly, there may be community organizations. So our fourth petal here is looking at folks who are advocating on behalf of those with lived experience. It could be, in this case, non-for-profit organizations, but in many cases, some of you might have thought about Universal Design for Learning guidelines from CAST, a link that's available within your slides. And even though they don't speak directly to AODA legislation, they are providing guidance for instructors like Ashley as one way to ensure that her classroom is accessible, that perhaps other petals on this flower are not. But finally, the epistemic center of the Voices flower is the privileging of persons with lived experience. And this is likely where a lot of you went to, is if you want to know about how best to make our classrooms accessible, we need to ask the students whose all of these policies, recommendations, research are impacting. And really doing this is critical to knowledge justice work because it counteracts the silencing that they've experienced, that marginalized voices have experienced, including those experiencing disability. And so we've included an example here. And this is why throughout this morning and what you'll continue to see through this webinar is why we're making sure to always include let's say non-traditional, non-academic sources like TikTok, like Facebook, like a blog, like something else. And it's because a lot of times voices like these are not included in academic discourse, in policy. We're not hearing directly from those with lived experience. Ashley, anything to add there?
I think that if we just look at the flower, and Heather did a great job saying, we are asking you to do this now as educators, but the way that the petals are articulated are also a little bit different when we're having students do this with a case that is more directed to their clinical practice context, where here, when we're talking about care providers, in this case study, we're talking about nurse educators, instructional designers, librarians, etc. Care providers will transform in the way that is articulated when we're talking about this to students. So, for example, if we were talking about a case in obstetrics, we might be talking about labor and delivery nurses, obstetricians, midwives, doulas, etc. So sometimes we do have to sit with this flower with students for a really long time and also name all of the structures that are informing and how we are engaging with knowledge at an institutional level, at a government level. So it is quite complex when we get to this part of this work.
So I want to say thank you to those of you who commented in the chat because we can start to see that you're already representing perspectives. Thank you to Zoe here. Perspectives in particular of voices that we may miss if we don't use this knowledge justice approach. So we're seeing some examples in the chat. Thanks, folks, from community organizations, from care providers, as well as from the government. And so here, my challenge to all of you would be, where are we teaching students to seek out and to privilege voices of persons with lived experience?
Great. So we spent some time, Heather spent some time going over sort of chapter 3, which is really getting into or asking learners to kind of dig into whose voices they actually want to seek out. So chapter 4 after that actually goes into some of the practical strategies for how you go about finding these voices and these perspectives. And there are 4 major strategies that we have in chapter 4 that you can see here on the slide. So adjusting our language, using existing tools to find these voices, seeking out lived experience, as Heather was speaking to, and then approaching Indigenous knowledges from a lens of knowledge justice. And we dive into these strategies in a lot more depth in the book, so feel free to check that out if you want to. Chapter 4 is definitely our longest chapter, but we'll quickly review a couple of them here as well, starting with adjusting our language. So one of the things that we discuss in the book is that language, like epistemology, is shaped by culture. And when we seek out diverse perspectives using a knowledge justice lens, it's important to ask, like, what language does the community use to describe themselves or their knowledge? And this is because externally defined terms, as you can see on the slide here, are usually top down. So knowledge holders like power holders or institutions decide how to describe people and communities. And these terms might be influenced by community voices, but they're not defined by them. By contrast, then, we have our self-chosen terms here on the slide as well. And these are terms that come up or come about in a bottom-up way. And this means that the community or the people involved will choose the language that best describes them. So on social media, we often talk about hashtags being a good way to kind of understand this. So this is one way that communities can define themselves and reflect on how they actually want to be seen and understood. And an example that we often give is the hashtag like actually autistic, which emerged from within the autistic community as a way to reclaim the conversation about autism. All right. And then I wanted to give an example of how we might brainstorm terminology as well when it comes to a topic and how varied it can be. So this one comes from a research project on abortion that Ashley and I were helping a student with. And we found it especially interesting because the political climate has such an influence on the language itself in terms of this topic. So looking at hashtags on social media, for example, you can see under community members there, we have terms like shout your abortion and abortion is healthcare. And these have been popularized as a way to break down taboos and stigmas about discussing abortion and as a resistance to the current political climate. But I also found it interesting to see how much terminology differed within these externally defined spaces. So your databases, government websites, that kind of thing. So we can see here the Canadian government and the United States government and how they differ in terms of their descriptions. So the Canadian government, if you go to their websites and things like that, they'll commonly use terms like medical abortion, abortion services, or reproductive rights. While the American government is more likely to use terms like elective abortion or abortion industry, for example. And so we can see even how those sort of subtle differences between abortion as a service or abortion as an industry can kind of lead to further stigmatization. And can impact the way that we might be thinking about how things are actually being described. So again, this is just something that we like to remind learners of when they're going in to actually seek out voices and needing to kind of reflect on these different terminologies that are being used and be mindful about them when it comes to their research itself. Next slide, Heather. All right, so once we've identified the language that we want to use, strategy 2 actually helps us put it into practice by using existing tools, including search engines like Google, academic databases, or generative AI like ChatGPT to find diverse voices. And we're not going to dive into all of that today, but as I said, feel free to check out the OER if you're interested in learning more about how to use those existing tools. But Heather is going to briefly chat about generative AI and how and whether it can be used to do knowledge justice work.
I'm muted. This is a topic that is top of mind for a lot of us, and to be honest, is something that will probably need to be continually revised as technology advances so quickly. Like as an example, we made this video and literally 3 days later, ChatGPT 5 was released. But in the book, what we talk about is the focus of knowledge justice and the strategies of what we're trying to do is to find those missing voices that have otherwise be silenced, marginalized, or demeaned, both by academics, by nursing, by society at large. And so if the focus of chapter 4 in this section of it is trying to use the tools that we have that are silencing to find those silenced voices, is it possible? So this section of the book looks at how products like ChatGPT were built and function and are used. And so an example that I have, and like I'll share this, I sound like a robot, so you have to be kind. But what I will say is I have curated my ChatGPT to be as knowledgeable about knowledge justice as I can. I've been working with it for a very long time and correcting it. And so I wanted to share what it thinks about whether we can use tools like this and how might we talk with students about using AI tools to practice knowledge justice. I thought I'd share that with you now.
Because we don't know how AI tools arrive at their answers.
Oops, come back.
Because we don't know how AI tools arrive at their answers or choose which websites to visit, we don't know whose perspectives they may be privileging. It's also only the very large for-profit companies like Google and Microsoft that can afford to create deep research products. How do advertisements influence which websites deep research products use in creating their reports? One final consideration before you use AI products to find diverse voices is their history.
Interesting. It said it blocked the media. Why? Enable media.
LLMs were built on data that was scraped from the internet without consent, including books, articles, social media posts, and other cultural expressions. This raises ethical concerns about intellectual theft.
Sorry, friends, I keep getting this error that says it's blocking the media. I'll keep trying, but if it keeps happening, then I'll just tell you what it's in.
And the exploitation of human knowledge, particularly from marginalized communities. And so to sum up, I asked my ChatGPT, can students learn about knowledge justice from AI tools like you?
Yes, I do think university students can and should use AI tools like me to learn about knowledge justice, but with critical awareness and in dialogue with other sources and voices. AI can be used to ask reflective questions, facilitate Socratic dialogue, or offer provocations to deepen understanding, but there are real limitations and risks. AI reproduces epistemic biases. Most AI tools, including me, are trained on predominantly Western, English language and academic sources. That means we tend to reflect the very hierarchies knowledge justice seeks to dismantle. AI can't model lived experience. This absence matters deeply when studying topics like indigenous epistemologies or Black feminist thought. Linda Tuhiwai-Smith reminds us that knowledge is inseparable from power and from the social context of its production. AI has no social location or ancestry. It's always an outsider to the knowledge systems it mediates. AI tools can support learning about knowledge justice if students treat them as scaffolding, not authority. But using AI critically is itself a practice of knowledge justice. It requires asking, who trained this system? Whose knowledge is missing? What is the system unable to see?
If you're interested in this topic a little bit more, the video gives some demonstrations of me trying some of these tools and using them in the way that our students are using them to try to find marginalized voices. And some ChatGPT does a half decent job, but some of them, the results are just horrible and really harmful. And so it's one of those ways that we can invite students to engage with tools like this and then talk about how best can we use them. And so that's why I talk to them here about, I give ChatGPT some of my language to edit, and then I tell it how racist it is. And Kate,
So,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Heather.
Nope.
Okay, so strategy 3 then is about seeking lived experience voices. And when I wanted to speak about this, because when we ask individuals, especially those from equity deserving communities, to speak about their personal experiences, we also can risk perpetuating epistemic injustices and causing harm if we have taken that information out of context, or if we demand it in ways that require additional labor. And those are often the experiences that we see the Black and Indigenous scholars talking about, and how they're engaging with nursing education, and how they're experiencing significant emotional labor when they are constantly being asked to perform in educating others about inclusion and anti-racism and decolonization and Indigenous knowledges. So in requesting individuals to share their story or explain your oppression, it can, of course, be very re-traumatizing, especially when they're asked to do this repeatedly without reciprocity in academic spaces. So one way we can engage with lived experience voices in a responsible way is to begin with stories that have already been shared publicly. And using this approach reduces the risk of placing unexpected emotional and educational labor on the individual that is having to navigate those oppressive forces. It also ensures that we're engaging with knowledge that people have intentionally chosen to make available in a form and in a context that they are comfortable with. So we have access to publicly shared lived experience sources, of course, in scholarly peer-reviewed work, like in research like autoethnographies or participatory action research or community-based methodologies. But when teaching students about seeking lived experience voices, we also are very much teaching them to seek out voices in often these overlooked places online, where we might find blogs or autobiographies or personal essays, as well as public testimonies and speeches, And specifically, we teach students to look at places like YouTube and social media because when we are looking at these places for lived experience voices, we're also applying a trauma and violence informed lens when engaging with lived experience voices. So I have to say about that. Oh, I don't know if we want to, do we have time?
No.
No. Next. Watch it later.
Yeah.
All right, so moving into chapter 5 here, often after we talk about like using the voices flower and places to seek out these diverse voices like we do in like chapters 3 and 4, the first question we get is, how do we know that the evidence that we're finding is good, like good in quotation marks there? And that's an understandable question that people have. So in chapter 5, we introduce an approach for assessing the knowledge that we found, which we've kind of split into 2 parts. So part 1 is using a framework, which we'll show in just a moment here, that encourages learners to evaluate the knowledge holder or source in terms of their reliability or their accuracy. And then part 2 is a set of questions that encourages learners to consider their evidence suite as a whole and to evaluate it for inclusivity. All right. So to start with that first part, evaluating for reliability and accuracy, one of the things that we want to address outright is that we're aware of the abundance of misleading information, particularly in today's media and political climate. And often these discussions focus on the information that we find on social media and online environments. And these are important conversations to have, obviously, because we do know that there's a lot of misdis and malinformation that gets like proliferated within these systems. But we also want folks to remember that these online spaces aren't the only places that we might encounter harmful information. So we often give the example of like the same person who might be like trolling online, leaving harmful comments, might go to work the next day and be an instructor, right? So reliability and ability to cause harm aren't defined by the type of source. Instead, we want to encourage people to think about the knowledge holder or holders at the center. And this brings us to our framework of harms, which shows different categories of potential harm or epistemic injustice. And these harms can be caused or perpetuated by any type of knowledge holder. So we can use this framework to evaluate any type of source, or at least that's the goal. And we show 5 types of harm here. So profit over people, misusing or falsifying authority, theft of knowledge, exclusion, deletion, and censorship, and harmful terminology. And then we also have a category here for considering AI-generated knowledge, like Heather just talked about, and the potential harms that can be caused by AI platforms. So in our book, there are prompt questions that accompany each of these categories to help learners consider whether their source or their knowledge holder is perpetuating harm. Next slide. Okay. So we wanted to give a quick example as well of how we might use this in a teaching context and how we have. So last month, Ashley and I taught in a first-year medicine class. And basically in this class, we were talking about critical appraisal, and we were teaching it from kind of 2 different lenses. But this, of course, could also be applied in a nursing context. So first, we discussed traditional critical appraisal. So we had students examine a few sources and then apply CASP and JBI appraisal tools to those sources. And we asked students to really reflect on the tools themselves, so the CASP and JBI critical appraisal tools. So in essence, we wanted them to think about, each source and how this could help determine the quality of knowledge for evidence-based practice in terms of the tools that they were looking at. And then after doing that activity, we talked to them a little bit more about knowledge justice and the voices flower and things like that. And so the next step was to introduce a knowledge justice informed approach to critical appraisal. So we had the students look at these sources again using the framework of harms with question prompts from the OER to guide their evaluation. So you'll see like a couple examples here. We have the categories of profit over people and theft of knowledge in some of these prompt questions. And then we had the students consider these questions from that knowledge justice perspective and think about it in relation to the sources they were looking at. So one source that students evaluated was the Dynamed entry on safe infant sleep. And so for the profit over people harm, we presented a screenshot, which you can see here, highlighting potential conflicts of interest in Dynamed content. So this prompted discussion around questions like, who owns Dynamed, who has access to this knowledge, and how might ownership or financial interests influence the information presented. So in this case, our goal wasn't to say that one way of doing critical appraisal was like better or worse than the other, but we really wanted to highlight that traditional critical appraisal tools may be really useful for considering like study quality, but maybe not as useful for examining the systems, platforms, or the social contexts shaping the knowledge itself. So really we're encouraging the students to use both lenses and to be thoughtful and critical in that way. So that's, again, one example of how this might be used in an instructional context. Right. And then the other piece that I talked about to this evaluation system that we've recommended within the OER is evaluating for inclusivity. So this is encouraging learners to evaluate their whole collection of evidence as a whole. And here we ask questions that help learners, again, consider the inclusivity of their collection of knowledge. So things like, does your evidence include multiple worldviews? Does it include diverse and intersectional creators? And does it include a range of diverse knowledge sources? As mentioned, we've only briefly touched on these forms of evaluation today, but we'll actually go into this piece of it, evaluation, a lot more in depth in the third webinar that we're doing. So this is just kind of a quick intro for now.
And in the final chapter of our book, and we always all joke it's our favorite chapter, and we didn't actually write a lot, but instead we just interviewed people about their thoughts and feelings and asked them questions and cry at watching the videos, because this is what really also helps contextualize the work that the students have gone through in this book to their professional practice setting. So in this chapter, we have posed questions like, how do your social identities shape the way you understand people, build relationships, and make decisions in your professional practice? But of course, we pose those to nurses in terms of their nursing practice. You've already seen Thomas answer that question, but we've also interviewed nurses, librarians, and counseling psychologists in terms of how this informs them as a helping professional. And we've interviewed individuals with diverse positionalities and walked them through answering each of these questions. And in watching each one of these videos and seeing people share, we also asked the learners in the textbook to reflect on and answer those same questions themselves. And so we find that the students really, again, can understand this content better when it's role modeled for them by individuals that are currently practicing in a professional context, and they're talking about how this is impacting them on a day-to-day basis in their workplace, in their professional role. Heather, do you have anything to add about it? No.
My question is, do you want me to play this?
Sure, for a bit, like 30 seconds. So we'll show you another one of our interviewees.
Why? I think that even if I do take things from a two-eyed seeing approach, I always aware of the fact that I still foundationally, from going to Western academia for so long, have somewhat been impacted and influenced by colonization. Or maybe not. I find that sometimes it's really easy to slip into that comfort of being like, okay, we need to like meet X deliverable to maintain our funding, but not really like slow down and listen to the actual voices. And there tends to be often a lot of disconnect across the board with Indigenous organizations and community for similar reasons. But, you know, I think as well, I have my own knowledge gaps when it comes to other knowledge systems from marginalized communities that I may not be aware of, and I may, you know, unintentionally cause harm or exclude some of those voices just by not knowing or not having gained those experiences myself, just from the work that I currently do. I find within my own person.
Thanks, Heather. So those are the type of videos we, again, show students so that they can see the application of sometimes really abstract things we're discussing, but why it matters for them in their professional role as a nurse. And we promised you resources today. So how are we assessing this in learners? In fact, we have an assignment that we shared in our resource book that you are welcome to use. And it is in the foundations course that I teach, where we simply ask students to create a reference list, but do so in a way that they have developed a diverse reference list, as Katie has just spoken to, in relation to evaluating our sources. And in doing this, we share case studies with students that you can read in the resource that we've shared with you, where they're professional practice case studies. And we're asking students to go and find voices that would inform their care of the individual in that case. And in this assignment, we ask students not only to include the citation for the resource that they are including in the reference list, but also to include the rationale for why they selected that specific resource. So we want to share with you very briefly now some preliminary findings that undergraduate students have shared with us in terms of what this experience has been like for them in terms of learning about epistemic justice, as well as what does it mean for them in seeking information. And I'll do this really quickly. And I will say, I don't have a very large pool of individuals, so that have actually completed all of these surveys and submitted their assignments and participated in these focus groups, but I did want to share with you what people are saying, and we will be continuing to collect data until we can actually meet criteria for when. Anyways, so one of the questions in the survey that we should ask students after they've learned about epistemic justice in their nursing foundation course is, how has this library guest lecture and their annotated bibliography assignment that they completed actually influenced their understanding of what counts as knowledge in their nursing practice? And what we can see in terms of respondents is about 60% said that they had a significant transformational shift on how they understood what counts as knowledge in their nursing practice. We also asked students to collect can you flip to the next slide? Sorry, Heather. We also asked students to collect and share their annotated bibliographies and resource lists that they developed. And in that, as I had mentioned, they did share their rationale for why they picked specific resources. So what are the students saying in terms of their rationale? One of the case studies in the course is about a trans feminine person that has a new diagnosis of HIV. And in this particular rationale, the student said, I chose this article because it focuses on integrating gender affirming care into HIV clinical practice, which aligns with my goal of providing inclusive, respectful care for trans feminine clients. This source helped me recognize that addressing clients' needs historically, including both medical and gendered related aspects, promotes better health outcomes and reinforces trust. So here we can see that students are beginning to look for resources that align with the patient's positionality, not the health condition that they're seeking care for alone. And another example from students about a case where a person is admitted to critical care. They are Indigenous and they're experiencing a lupus flare-up. The student said, I chose this reference as the author, as it was authored by a member of the Wikmekong First Nation, and he writes, Indigenous peoples have the right to their traditional medicines and to maintain their health practices, including the conservation of their vital medical plants. I think it's especially important to recognize recognize physiological impacts of healing as many of the prior references are derived from biomedical and empiric data, or psychological rather. So here we can also see the student is considering the positionality in terms of authorship. So who is the creator of this knowledge and this content? Another example that I wanted to share is about the same case where a student said, I feel that before I can properly care for others and address external biases, I need to first address my own biases towards myself. Uncovering that my imposter syndrome is valid allows me to see the world in a different way that helps me shape my nursing practice and how I may be an ally to BIPOC individuals whose perspectives are not considered. This really shows that students are beginning to critically reflect on their own positionality and how that shapes the nurse-client relationship, and talk about how they need to reflect on their own biases before they're engaging in safe care. Another example that I wanted to share with you from focus groups that we conducted, where students were asked, how did you find that this course and this assignment influenced the way you now view nursing knowledge? One student said, and then also that reflection, the idea like nursing knowledge has been really nice to kind of fight off that imposter syndrome as as I am, reapproaching post-secondary studies, and everything I've done to date also has value and can bring unique perspectives into schooling and into research. Another student, when asked the same question, said, it has been really helpful, the idea that there is an art of nursing and that it's a journey. It really resonated for them, and that knowledge is found inside of you, and that there's many different successful approaches that can be found in nursing, and that's the phrase art of nursing means to them, and how it relates to the kind of nursing knowledge and epistemic knowledge. So here the student really felt reaffirmed, and that they had value as a knower themselves, and they also found value in other diverse epistemologies and ways of doing and being, like in art-based knowledge systems. Heather already alluded to this, but often in these moments when we're teaching students about this work in class, what happens is you can see it all over their face, where all of a sudden they are feeling valued as learners, they are feeling seen as learners, they are feeling heard as learners, and that they are also considered to be knowledgeable, and that they should be taking up space in nursing practice. So I wanted to share these results because a lot of what Heather and I have seen, and Katie as well, has seen in the classroom when teaching this, is that students are feeling empowered in their nursing practice. So what have we learned from all of this, I guess? This is where it might get a little muddled because I'm still trying to sort this out myself. But some of the learning that we've really had in teaching this, and if you're wanting to teach this in your classroom, is that prerequisite learning is necessary in terms of they really have to interrogate the history of the profession, as well as have a critical reflection on their individual positionality. Now, that work doesn't need to be in one course. It could be scaffolded or layered across a curriculum, of course. We also have learned that it's really important when talking about this, not just within nursing, but in any health professional context, that we need to make it clear and upfront and do this early when we begin to dialogue about this, that empiric biomedical post-positivist approaches are actually important and meaningful too. We're not trying to say that these are bad approaches. We're not trying to say that they are wrong. We are actually asking people to hold multiple truths. And especially when working with individual disciplines like bench science related disciplines, this is a really important step in calling people into this work rather than calling them out, and making them feel safe and engaging in these activities. Also, as Heather mentioned, the discipline-specific case studies really help anchor this context, and we must share examples of epistemic injustices that are disciplinary specific, as well as examples of how you can enact epistemic justice in your specific discipline. Did you want to talk about relationships, Heather, or do you want me to talk about
I don't
relationships?
mind.
Okay.
I think it's clear that none of this work would have been possible without one another. I think a willingness to find and to enter into this work with an acceptance that we don't really know what we're doing, and but that our values aligned has been really critical. And I think we'll talk more about this at our next webinar when we discuss decolonization initiatives that we've been collaborating on. But like something Katie and I reflected of is librarians and nurses hold a lot of similarity, and we have approached our disciplines hold more in common than not. And so in collaborating together, it's really been allowing us to learn a lot. But a partner that we haven't talked about today that we will have more time to discuss in our future webinars is the role of students. And I don't know how to describe to you how really all of our learning has come from them. It's come in formal ways, like through some of the study results Ashley has shared, but I would say more pivotally, it's been in their willingness to be vulnerable in the classroom so that when we make space in our teaching to invite discussions of sensitive topics where they have felt silenced, it has changed my whole understanding of my profession and of teaching and everything else. And so a lot of the content that you see in our book has come from student partners, and we can't celebrate all of them today, but please make sure to celebrate them through the collaborators list on the book, because you'll see how many students have informed our decolonization curriculum, the creation of the everything, the OER, absolutely everything has been informed specifically, shout out to nursing students. Katie, did you want to add anything else? I know I kind of spoke for you there.
No, I was just going to say that the nursing students, we worked with some nursing students who actually created a lot of the case studies that we use to inform our work. And that's been really just so valuable in terms of them taking their own experiences and actually being able to share those to help people kind of understand how they might, seek voices around certain cases and things like that.
Can I talk or do you want to talk?
Yeah, like I just want to say one more thing about number 5 on the last slide too. Like I cannot emphasize how much I saw in the chat, like Heather said, we cry a lot. I cry a lot in front of a classroom of 300 people. I've learned a lot in this work that being upfront and vulnerable with students, and sometimes as faculty, I think we're scared to do that because we are worried that they will not see us as knowledge holders ourselves. That's something that we all need to rattle with, because when I have removed that layer of myself and been very vulnerable with students about complex life experiences I've had to navigate, about also how I have moved through my unlearning, it has created spaces for all students in my classroom to share some of their vulnerabilities that they've also had to navigate. And that was a really scary thing for me to do when I started doing this work, especially in that I was a younger faculty and don't have, this, which we'll talk about a lot more in our last webinar, about the structures, but I don't have a continuing appointment, right? And so some of this work is really scary to do. But to be successful, to really be successful and create a safe space for learners to do it, it is really important that we are also being vulnerable alongside with them and admitting the things that we don't know. Yeah. Okay, I'm done talking now.
Well, you can
And
talk about this.
okay, yeah, I was gonna say, but now I'm gonna talk about something else. Okay, so I feel that today we really were trying to focus specifically on how we teach this, mostly in an undergraduate context. We have taught this in all sorts of places. So if anyone wants to talk about very specifically the cohort, the type of student, the class, we would love to dialogue about that further. In upcoming weeks, we're going to start to transition to talk about you yourself as an educator and a researcher in terms of how you might enact epistemic justice at a curriculum, at a course, at a curricular and pedagogical approaches that you're engaging with, but is also, if you're engaged in scholarship or research, how you might enact epistemic justice in those places. We will spend a lot of our week 3 session talking a lot more about our framework of harms and evidence synthesis approaches, for example, as well as two-eyed seeing approaches and critical appraisal. And then in our final session, we will get to some of those taking a step back. How do we go from minor to major reforms at an institutional level, disrupting policy, engaging in, Heather is a ICAP expert, so she will be speaking to some of her work there. So we really hope to be seeing you back, and we really hope that you will please share our webinar series with your colleagues. And that's all I have to say about that. And does anybody maybe have any questions?
We have time for 13 minutes of discussion, and then we'll include our email addresses here. A reminder from Keith that we have the Q&A function open, as well as the chat for any questions you have about our work. You're welcome, Lisa. Thank you. We can get more honest in the future webinars, Kristen.
Oh, yeah. Maybe what I will also say is, so someone has a real question. Yay. Have you experienced, oops, sorry. So one of the questions is, have you experienced some institutional barriers in this work or challenges?
Yep. Okay. I think we have.
Go first, Heather. You go first.
Yeah, I have like a burning thing. Here's what I will say is, and this will come as no surprise to those of you who have self-selected to be here. Some folks are not ready for this work. The other thing that I will say, our lived experience has reflected what we hear about in folks who have been doing this work a lot longer, is that privilege creates blindness. And so the more likely someone is to hold power and privilege in our academic system, we are finding there's a correlation, let's say. And so for Western libraries in particular, it was a small group of us who started doing this work. It is not a shared approach of knowledge justice teaching and librarianship across all of Western. It's not to say folks are resistant or negative. It's just there's a different level of relationship. And it's honestly why we'll be talking about this at the next webinar, is the difference it's taken in this work as individual instructors, and how that looks a lot different than at a systems level. And so that's, I do talk a little bit about it in the article that we linked in there, so that I don't have to be super specific here. But yeah, we have. The system is working the way it was designed, as we are seeing with financial pressures in our province and across the country in the reprioritization of EDI work. We knew this would happen. We know this would happen. Folks have been in decolonization work a lot longer, forewarned us. But I appreciate the question, Kristen.
I would say, I have so many things to say about this. In fact, I could probably talk about this exact question for 2 hours. So it's a fantastic question. What I will say about this in all of the courses that we have taught this in, and Katie and Heather and myself have probably taught this to 10 different disciplines, maybe more, at Western University in multiple different levels of their learning, is that the students are largely ready for this content. They live it. Because they have been disvalued and discounted as knowers themselves. Where we do maybe encounter some barriers is often in leadership places, where we have individuals that have been learned and socialized in professional programs, to value that hierarchy of epistemologies that really privileges post-positivism, for example. And when people's entire life work in research programs are grounded in that, that's where discomfort can really come in this work because it becomes very personal, right? And so I think that goes back to one of the key learnings we had in when framing this discussion with anyone, including leaders. It's to not say that is bad, but it's good too and important. But there's other good things that we would like to speak to and create space for. So a lot of the reflections that Heather and Katie and I dialogue around are not necessarily about the students, because this essentially becomes like grassroots participatory action in curricula, where when we get into undergraduate programs and begin to teach students this, it's disruptive. And people have led us in their class, and then the students are, so powerful, and they go off and start to question their other instructors in their other courses about, why are you teaching me that when I'm assessing hypertension and I need to be prescribing somebody different medications because they're Black? What is that about? And in some ways, in my program, that has been led by a leader that is relational and has a growth mindset. It has offered us opportunities to really interrogate our program and transform it in a much safer way for students through them teaching faculty what they have learned, and asking them questions about why they're teaching things that way. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting process that we've kind of all moved through. But when we're talking about making big change, when we get to lesson or our workshop 4 about that transformation from minor to major reform, Heather and Katie and I have really stepped back in the last year and decided that our target isn't necessarily our students. They are ready for it, and they're supporting us doing this work through challenging. But our target really needs to be leadership and how we can kind of transform their minds potentially in a way that they can also hold these multiple truths. Yeah.
So Ashley, we got an anonymous question in the Q&A that asked you to speak to the nature of response from educators who have received students from your course. So you're speaking about that directly. So I said that we would answer the question live because you were literally saying those words while the person's question came in. So thank you to that person. They also ask, how are the educators changing or not, and how are students responding to that resistance? So we did speak to that. So something I'll say as someone who's supporting this work across multiple disciplines, a shout out to nursing. The values that you espouse as a profession are preparing your colleagues to step into this space when invited. And I am watching the influence that one person like Ashley can make on a whole school. And I wondered, Katie, like you're seeing these students, yeah? And I just wondered, do you want to tell any stories about that?
Yeah, I can speak to this a little bit in terms of Ashley often describes this as like a side project that we do, is our knowledge synthesis work. So at Western Libraries, I'm part of the systematic and scoping review team, and supporting researchers in that capacity. And so one of the things that's been really cool to see recently is that students have been seeking out this knowledge justice lens to inform, or they're interested in seeing how it can be used to inform their knowledge synthesis projects. And so far, the students that we've been working with are largely from nursing, and though we have had a consult from library science as well. But it's been really cool to see how these students are, receptive to this. Maybe they learn about it in a class, and then they're interested in seeing how they can apply it to their research. And working with, supervisors like Ashley or Faye, who was here before, they are asking really good questions, and really kind of bringing this to the forefront in both their research as well as their coursework. So that's been really inspiring to see.
I'm partnering with a faculty colleague in library science this term, and we're co-supervising six graduate students after similar sort of on learning happened for her in attending some of these workshops. So that would be another sort of plug for collaborating with your library partners. Not all librarians are engaged in knowledge justice work similarly, but this book was created for them in mind as well. And so if you find you have a librarian friend and you'd like to engage and talk more with us about what it's meant to work together with like let's call it a triple partnership, students, faculty, and librarianship, then just let us know, because I think it's the students have power and agency that we've never given them before in this way to teach us what it's like to live this every day. The other thing I see in the chat is our friend Zoe, who is in our chat. She's one of the chapter 1 authors and a dear colleague from the Faculty of Health Sciences, and is helping us do this work. And I'm so grateful that she's here and able to cry with us on a daily basis because we need her. Did I miss any chat questions, friends? Okay. We've never finished on time, so can we
Never.
like Yes, thank you, Stacy. Well, Keith?
Yeah, if we have no more questions, I think we're good to end it here then. I'd like to thank everyone again for registering for this. And once again, thank you to our presenters. So Heather, Katie, and Ashley, thank you so much for this. It has been very insightful. A reminder to everyone too that this will be recorded and uploaded to Kaizen's YouTube as well in the near future. We hope to see you all for part 2, which will be on October 23rd at the same time between 11 and 1 Eastern. And hope everyone else has a great rest of their day.
And thank you to Keith for all your support in getting us organized and ready for today.
Thank you, Keith.
Thank you.